Late afternoon, 1,880, at the Stagecoach Station in Dustville, Arizona. Dot, a woman, kneels in the dirt, hands shaking as she gathers scattered papers, while whispers cut through the crowd behind her. That bruise on her neck, somebody already got the worst of her. A tall stranger crouches beside her, silently picking up every page. He rises, faces the crowd, and says one line, low and unshaken. At Silver Creek, we judge a person by the work in their hands, not the scars on their face. What this woman is about to do to his life, and this whole town, he has no idea. The story starts now. Like and subscribe so you don't miss it. The Stagecoach came in 20 minutes late. Nobody was surprised. The Dustville station ran on its own clock, somewhere between whenever and God willing. And the passengers who stepped off that coach looked exactly like they'd been rattled across 200 miles of Arizona hardpan in a wooden box. Which, of course, they had. Jarrett Vance stood at the far edge of the platform, with his hat pulled low and his thumbs hooked in his belt. He wasn't the kind of man who fidgeted. He'd been waiting since noon, and now the sun had slid far enough west to throw long orange shadows across the dirt. And he was still just standing there, still, patient, the same way he stood when he was scouting, reading what was in front of him before he decided what to do about it. He watched the door of the coach swing open. A carpet bag came first, tossed out by the driver without ceremony, then a wooden suitcase, battered at every corner, the brass latches gone green with age. It hit the platform steps, bounced once, and landed in the dirt below. Then the woman climbed down. She was slight. Her traveling dress was the color of old dust, practical and plain, and she moved carefully the way a person moves when they're used to watching where they put their feet. She had a bonnet on, the brim wide enough to throw her face into shadow, and she kept her chin dipped just enough to stay inside that shadow. She stepped off the last step, reached for her suitcase, and the latch gave. The whole thing burst open. Papers went everywhere. Legal-sized pages, covered edge to edge in fine printed text, scattered across the dirt like leaves off a cottonwood. Spools of thread rolled away in 3 directions. A pair of small scissors skidded under the wheel of the coach. A fold of dark fabric slipped out and dropped into a puddle of something. Jarrett chose not to identify. The woman made a sharp, involuntary sound, not a cry, just the breath knocked out of her by one more thing going wrong. She dropped to her knees immediately and started gathering the pages. That was when the whispers started. Jarrett heard them without turning his head. He'd spent enough years on the frontier to listen in all directions at once that the mail-order bride Vance sent for. Lord, look at her face. That bruise goes all the way down her neck. What kind of man sends a woman out here looking like? Damaged goods is what she is. Somebody's already gotten the worst of her. He heard the woman's shoulders tighten before he saw it. Some part of her heard it too. She kept her head down and kept gathering her papers. Jarrett pushed off the post he'd been leaning against and walked over. He didn't hurry. He didn't make a production of it. He just crossed the platform, stepped down off the boards into the dirt, and crouched beside her. He picked up the nearest page. It was dense with legal language territorial codes from the look of it, annotated in the margins in a small, precise hand. He picked up the next one. Same thing. The woman paused for just a second when she saw his hands reaching for her papers, and he felt that pause the way you feel a shift in wind direction. He kept his hands easy and slow. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her hands. They were calloused across the palms, ink-stained at the fingertips. The kind of stain that doesn't wash out no matter how hard you scrub. The knuckles were red from the cold of the coach, and there was a small burn scar on the side of her right thumb, the kind you get from a typesetting iron. These were hands that had been working for a long time. He stacked the pages carefully, keeping them in the order they'd landed as best he could, and held them out to her. She took them without looking up. Behind him, he heard someone laugh. Quiet, mean, the kind of laugh people do when they want you to hear it, but can't be accused of saying anything outright. Jarrett stood up slowly and turned around. There were maybe a dozen people on and around the platform, a couple of ranch wives, two men from the feed store, old Pete Garland from the hotel, arms crossed, shaking his head like he was watching a bad hand of cards get played out. Jarrett looked at them. Not long, just long enough. At Silver Creek, he said, we judge a person by the work in their hands, not the scars on their face. He said it the same way he said most things, quiet even, like a statement of fact rather than a defense. Nobody laughed again. He turned back to the woman on the ground. She had gathered most of the papers by now and was trying to press them back into the suitcase. The latch was broken clean off on one side. The case wasn't going to close right, and they both knew it. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather strap, the kind he used to tie down rolled maps when he was scouting. He set it down on top of the suitcase in front of her and stepped back. She looked at the strap. Then, for the first time, she looked up at him. The bruise was worse than the whispers had made it sound. It started at her cheekbone and ran down the side of her face and throat in shades of purple and yellow-green. Already a few days old, already fading at the edges, but still dark enough at the center to make a man's jaw clench. She had gray-green eyes from dust or crying, or both, and she was looking at him like she was waiting for his expression to shift into something she recognized. Pity, disgust, ownership. He kept his face where it was. Name's Jarrett Vance, he said. Silver Creek is about 9 miles northeast. Road's decent most of the way. He nodded at the strap. That'll hold the case until we can get the latch fixed in town. She looked at him for another second. Then she looked at the strap. She picked it up herself, looped it around the suitcase herself, pulled it tight, and buckled it with steady hands. Even though her fingers were shaking slightly at the end, she stood up. Evelyn Sterling, she said. Her voice was low and a little rough, like she hadn't used it much in the past few days. People call me Evie. Evie, he repeated. He reached down and picked up her carpet bag before she could, because that one he could carry without asking. It was just sensible. And he gestured toward the wagon. I've got water in the wagon if you're thirsty. It's a warm ride. She picked up the repaired suitcase herself, he noticed. He didn't comment. They walked toward the wagon side by side, with a foot of space between them, and the platform crowd watched them go. Jarrett didn't look back at the crowd. Neither did Evie, though he caught, just for a second, the smallest lift of her chin as they cleared the platform steps. Not much, maybe a quarter inch, but it was there. He loaded the carpet bag into the wagon bed and climbed up to the driver's seat. She climbed up on her own, a little stiffly, like something in her midsection ached when she reached, and settled herself on the bench with her suitcase wedged between her feet. He clicked the horses forward, and they rolled out of Dustville in the long copper light of late afternoon. For the first several miles, neither of them said a word. The road ran through dry scrubland, past stands of saguaro throwing long shadows east, past a dry creek bed that wouldn't see water again until the summer rains. A hawk circled somewhere high up to the south. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was more like two people quietly deciding how much space the other one needed. Eventually, Evie spoke. The pages, she said. The legal papers. They're copies I made of the original mortgage documents you sent. She paused. I noticed some of the interest clauses read strangely. I was going to ask you about them. Jarrett glanced at her sideways. You read mortgage documents for entertainment. I was a court clerk for 4 years, she said simply. And before that, I worked in a print shop. I read everything. He looked back at the road. What was strange about the clauses? The phrasing in sections 3 and 7 doesn't match standard territorial mortgage language. It's close, but it's not the same. She had one of the pages out now, held flat against her knee so the wind wouldn't take it. I could be wrong. You think you're wrong. A pause. No. Jarrett said nothing for a moment. Silver Creek's eastern fence line appeared ahead, running along the ridge in the last red light of the day. Then we'll look at them tonight, he said. She folded the page back into her coat pocket carefully, like it mattered which. He was beginning to understand. It probably did. The ranch gate came into view. The carved wooden sign, swinging slow in the dry desert wind. She looked up at it as they passed under. He watched her read it without looking like he was watching. Whatever she'd been bracing for on that long, rattling ride from Philadelphia, he didn't know. He couldn't know yet. But she was here now, on this land, under this sky, with her repaired suitcase and her ink-stained hands and her stack of annotated legal pages. Whatever came next, she'd arrived with tools. That told him more than anything else could have. The attic room at Silver Creek was small but clean. Someone had put fresh linen on the cot, folded at the corner with military precision. There was a wash basin on the stand, a cracked mirror above it, and a single oil lamp on the windowsill that threw a warm circle of light across the plank floor. The window faced east, and through it in the last gray minutes of dusk, Evie could see the dark line of the ridge and the first few stars coming out above it. Maeve had fed her without ceremony: thick stew, hot cornbread, black coffee that could strip paint. The old cook had set the plate in front of her at the kitchen table, looked her over once with sharp, dark eyes, said eat all of it, and turned back to the stove. No questions, no soft, searching looks. Evie had eaten every bite. Jarrett had shown her up the stairs himself, carrying her carpet bag. He'd set it inside the door, pointed out where the extra blankets were kept in the cedar chest, and told her the pump in the yard worked fine but ran cold this time of year. Then he'd said good night and gone back downstairs. That was it. No lingering in the doorway. No speech about expectations or arrangements or what she owed him for the trouble of sending the train fare. Just good night and the sound of his boots going back down the stairs. She'd stood in the middle of the room for a full minute after that, not quite sure what to do with the absence of threat. She unpacked slowly, hung her second dress on the peg behind the door, set her sewing kit on the windowsill, stacked her annotated mortgage pages on the small writing table in the corner, weighted down with the wash basin's soap dish so they wouldn't drift. She brushed out her hair, braided it, and got into the cot with the lamp still burning low. Outside, the wind had picked up. She was almost asleep when the first crack of thunder hit. It rolled across the valley like a cannon shot, and every muscle in her body locked up at once. She was sitting upright before she was fully awake, heart slamming, one hand already out to brace against something that wasn't there. Lightning came, a white flash through the window that lit the whole room for half a second. Then the rain hit the roof like gravel thrown by the fistful. She made herself breathe. She lay back down. She counted the seconds between the lightning and the thunder the way her mother had taught her when she was small. Back before she knew there were worse things to be afraid of than storms. The ribs started hurting about an hour later. It always did in the cold. It always did in the damp. The bone had knit badly. She'd never had it properly set, because setting it would have meant a doctor, and a doctor would have meant questions, and questions would have meant she cut the thought off. It started as a deep ache. Then it sharpened. She shifted position. That made it worse. She pressed the heel of her palm against her side and breathed shallow and slow, the way she'd learned, and stared at the ceiling and waited for it to pass the way it sometimes did. It didn't pass. By midnight, each breath was its own small battle. She had her knees drawn up and her forehead beaded with sweat despite the cold, and she was gritting her teeth so hard her jaw ached. She heard the boots on the stairs. They stopped outside her door. A knock. Quiet but deliberate. Not tentative, not demanding. Just a knock. "Lights still on under your door," Jarrett said from the hallway. "Thought I'd check." She didn't answer immediately. She was breathing through a spike of pain that radiated up through her shoulder blade and didn't want to speak through it and have her voice come out wrong. The silence stretched. "I've got liniment," he said. "Maeve's recipe. It helps with old injuries in the cold. I can leave it outside the door." Another spike. She pressed harder with her palm, and it helped exactly nothing. "Come in," she said. The door opened. Jarrett stepped inside, one hand holding a small clay jar, the other holding the lamp he'd brought up from downstairs. He was in his work clothes, still shirt, unlaced at the collar, and he looked like a man who hadn't been to sleep either. He took one look at her knees pulled up, arm pressed to her side, face white as the linen, and started to move toward her automatically. One step, maybe two, she slammed back into the corner of the cot, so hard the frame scraped the floor. Her back hit the wall, and she pressed against it, and the sound that came out of her wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob, but it was both of them at once. "Don't touch me." Jarrett stopped. She was shaking, not from cold. Her whole body was shaking, and she hated it. Hated that she couldn't stop it. Hated that the tears came with it, hot and humiliating, because she'd told herself 100 times on that long stagecoach ride that she was done crying. She was done flinching. She was done being a person who shook in corners. "Nobody believes how much it hurts," she said. Her voice broke on it, and she let it break, because the bruises fade. But the bones remember. Jarrett didn't move. He stood exactly where he was, 4 feet from the bed, and he looked at her not with pity, not with the wounded pride of a man who'd been accused of something, just looked at her steadily, the way you look at someone you're trying to understand. Then he took 3 deliberate steps backward. He raised both hands, opened palms out, and held them there. "Okay," he said. "That was all. Just okay." He crouched down slowly, still at the far side of the room, and set the clay jar on the floor. He set his lamp beside it. Then he reached to his hip, unholstered his revolver, and set it down next to the jar, not hidden, right there in the open, where she could see it, and he couldn't reach it without crossing the room. He straightened up, reached into his shirt pocket, and held something out at arm's length. A key, old iron, slightly bent at the bow. He crouched again and slid it across the floor toward her. It skated across the planks and stopped a foot from the cot. "This room is yours," he said. "The key is on the inside now. You hold the power over your own safety. Here." He looked at her steadily. "I'm going to leave. You put that key in the lock after I go, and nobody opens that door without your permission. Not me, not Hank, nobody." Evie stared at the key on the floor. Her breathing was still ragged. The ribs still screamed. But something in the room had shifted, and it wasn't the storm. "The liniment," Jarrett said. "You rub it in slow with your knuckles, along the line of the rib. It'll smell like pine tar and something Maeve refuses to name. It works." He picked up his lamp, not the revolver, not the key, and moved toward the door. "Holler if you need anything. I'll hear you." He stepped out and pulled the door shut behind him. She heard his boots go down 2 steps. Then they stopped. She understood he was waiting not to listen, not to intrude, just standing close enough to hear if the pain got bad enough that she needed help. She picked up the key. She crossed to the door and she locked it. Then she crossed back, picked up the clay jar, pried the lid off, and the smell hit her pine tar. Yes, and something sharp and green underneath it, and something almost sweet at the back of it. She pulled her nightgown aside and pressed her knuckles to her ribs and worked the liniment in slow. After about 10 minutes, the sharpness began to ease. Not gone, but something she could breathe around. She sat on the edge of the cot for a long time after that. The storm was moving east now, the thunder getting further away, the rain gentling from a roar to a hiss. She looked at the revolver, still sitting on the floor across the room. He'd left it there, not hidden, not taken back, just there, available, in case she needed it, and he wasn't close enough. She thought about that for a while. Then she got up, picked up the revolver, turned it over in her hands once. She checked the cylinder, out of habit, fully loaded. Hammer on an empty chamber, safe, and set it on the windowsill beside her sewing kit. She got back into the cot. She didn't sleep right away, but she lay there in the dark, listening to the rain thin out against the roof. And she breathed steadily, and her ribs ached, and the room was locked, and the key was in her hand. It was a strange thing. being in a strange house, a strange territory, 9 miles from the nearest town, with a man she'd known for less than a full day sleeping somewhere below her, and feeling, for the first time in 2 years, like she might be safe. She didn't trust the feeling entirely, but she didn't push it away either. She put the key under her pillow, closed her eyes, and let the last of the storm carry her down into sleep. In the morning, the world outside the attic window was washed clean in pale gold. When she came downstairs, Jarrett was already at the table, with a cup of coffee and a stack of fencing invoices, going through them with the methodical patience of a man doing a job he didn't particularly enjoy, but understood needed doing. He looked up when she came in, looked at her once assessing. Quick, and whatever he saw satisfied him, because he just nodded toward the coffee pot on the stove. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Better than expected," she said. Maeve pushed a plate of eggs in front of her before she'd fully sat down. Nobody mentioned the night before. That was fine. That was more than fine. She ate her eggs and drank her coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the silver morning light on the mountains. And she thought that maybe she'd been wrong about what she was walking into when she'd answered that advertisement in the Philadelphia Courier 6 weeks ago. She was going to have to wait and see, but for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. Waiting didn't feel like something being done to her. It felt like a choice. It rained again on the third night, softer this time, and Evie stayed up past midnight with the lamp burning and 4 months of Silver Creek's financial records spread across the kitchen table. She'd asked Jarrett that morning if she could look at them. He'd stood in the barn doorway with a piece of harness leather in his hands and looked at her for a moment. And she'd braced herself for the usual response, the careful explaining that the finances were complicated, that she wouldn't understand, that he had it handled, the polite version, condescending version, the version Gideon had always used. Right up until it turned out he'd drained her savings account to nothing and sold her father's print press for drinking money. "Kitchen table's free after supper," Jarrett said. "Ledgers are in the bottom drawer of the desk in the study. Help yourself." That was it. She'd pulled the ledgers out after supper while he was doing the evening rounds, and Maeve had refilled her coffee twice without being asked. And now it was past midnight, and she understood why the finances seemed complicated. They'd been made to seem complicated. On purpose, she set down the page she was holding and pressed her fingertips to her eyes. The original mortgage on Silver Creek had been signed 11 years ago, between Jarrett's father, Edmund Vance, deceased 3 years now, and the Dustville Territorial Bank. Standard terms, reasonable interest, 30-year repayment. She'd seen 100 documents like it in her 4 years as a court clerk. But tucked into sections 3 and 7, buried in language dense enough that you'd need a legal background and a reason to be suspicious to catch it, were clauses that hadn't been in the standard form. Variable acceleration clauses, written in language that almost looked like the surrounding text. Same hand, same ink. But the ink was wrong. She'd noticed it first by lamplight, the way certain lines caught the light differently, a faint iridescence that regular iron gall ink didn't have. She'd seen it once before, in a fraud case that had come across her clerk's desk in Philadelphia, a technique specialized fading ink mixed to match a document's existing text used to add language to contracts after they'd been signed. Someone had altered this mortgage after Edmund Vance put his name on it, and those altered clauses had been quietly compounding Silver Creek's debt for 11 years, bending the repayment terms in increments small enough not to trigger alarm, large enough that by the end of this fiscal year, the ranch would owe the bank nearly double what the original loan had specified. She read the clauses again. Then again, she wanted to be certain. She was certain. She heard the back door open and close and Jarrett's boots cross the mudroom. He came into the kitchen, stopped when he saw the spread of papers across the entire table, and looked at her face. "You found something," he said, not a question. Sit down, she said. I need to show you something, and I need you to follow me through it carefully, because it's not simple. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. She had done this before, explained complex legal language to people who hadn't been trained in it. She'd done it for farmers in the Philadelphia courthouse waiting room, for seamstresses who'd been swindled by their suppliers, for men and women who were smart and capable and had simply never been given access to the kind of education that would let them read the traps that had been set for them. The key, she'd learned, was not to simplify the ideas. The ideas weren't actually that complicated. The key was to strip out the language designed to obscure them. She started with Section 3. This clause, as originally written, sets a fixed interest rate, she said. Standard. But these two lines here, she pointed. Let him look were added after your father signed. You can see it if you hold the page at an angle to the lamp. The ink has a slightly different sheen. Someone used a specialized formula. It dries to match the surrounding ink closely enough that a casual reader won't catch it. But it's there. Jarrett leaned forward, tilted the page the way she'd shown him, held it there for a long moment. I see it, he said. His voice was very even. What those two lines do is convert the fixed rate to a variable one, tied to a regional index that hasn't been published publicly since 1879, which means the bank or whoever controls the bank's calculations can adjust the rate without any external check on whether the adjustment is legitimate. She set that page aside and pulled the next one over. Section 7 is worse. This clause, the one added here, creates an acceleration provision. If the variable rate causes the outstanding balance to exceed a threshold that was calculated to be hit right about now, in 1886, the entire remaining loan balance becomes due in 60 days. Jarrett sat back. He wasn't a man who showed a lot on his face, but his jaw had tightened, and he was looking at the pages with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who's just understood that something they thought was solid ground has been hollow the whole time. 60 days, he said, at the rate the compounding has been running. You'll hit the threshold before spring, she said. When that happens, the bank notifies you that the full remaining balance is due. You can't pay it in 60 days. Nobody could. The ranch goes to foreclosure, and whoever controls the foreclosure process buys it for a fraction of what it's worth. Silence outside. The rain tapped steadily against the kitchen window. Who controls the bank? She asked. The expression that crossed Jarrett's face then was complicated. Anger. Yes, but underneath it, something older and colder, like a wound that had been given time to scar over and had now been pressed. My uncle, he said. Judge Vance Thorne. He sits on the bank's board of trustees. Has since my father took out the original loan. He was quiet for a moment. My father trusted him. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that would make it better. And she'd learned the hard way that people didn't need you to make it better. They needed you to tell them the truth and let them sit with it for a moment and decide what they were going to do. She let him sit. After a minute, he said, What do we do? First, we document everything. She pulled a clean sheet of paper from the stack she'd brought down from the writing desk. I'm going to write out a clause-by-clause comparison, the original mortgage language versus the altered language, with notes on the ink discrepancy. We need it in plain terms that a territorial court can follow without needing to be lawyers themselves. She dipped her pen and started writing as she talked. Second, we need the original signed document, not a copy. The original, with Edmund Vance's signature on it. Is it here on the ranch? Should be, Jarrett said. I keep all the founding documents in the document box in the seed barn. My father built a small vault into the floor out there, fireproof lining. Iron door. Good. We need it intact and accessible. Because if this goes before a territorial judge, the altered clauses have to be compared against the original signature document to prove the additions were made after signing. Jarrett nodded slowly. He was watching her write. the neat, precise lines filling up the page. "There's something else," she said. She didn't look up from the page. "The interest calculations that have been applied, I cross-referenced them against the bank statements in the back of the ledger. They don't match the stated rate on the altered clause either. They're higher, which means whoever is running this isn't just using the altered contract. They're charging above even what the fraudulent clause specifies." She looked up then. "This isn't a legal technicality," she said. "This is a coordinated effort to steal this land. The altered contract gives it a paper justification. The excess interest accelerates the timeline. And I would bet everything I own, which admittedly isn't much right now, that the foreclosure process is already being arranged before the 60-day notice is even sent." Jarrett held her gaze. "How do you know all this?" he asked. Not skeptically, not in the way men had asked her that question before. "Meaning you couldn't possibly." Just genuinely asking. "I was a court clerk for 4 years, she said. "I processed every document that came through that office. Deeds, mortgages, inheritance filings, fraud complaints. I read all of it." She paused. "And I worked in a print shop for 2 years before that. I know what ink looks like. I know how it ages. And I know when something's been printed or written at a different time than the rest of the document," he nodded. Slow. "Thinking. In Philadelphia," she went on. "I watched a judge, an honest one, rare as they are, dismantle a scheme almost exactly like this one. A land development company had been altering mortgage contracts for smaller landowners all across the county. 15 families lost their homes before anyone caught it. She set her pen down. The honest judge caught it because a clerk, a woman, actually, who'd been doing her job quietly for 6 years and wasn't supposed to be involved in litigation, noticed the ink discrepancy on one document and flagged it. She picked the pen back up. "The difference here," she said, "is that we caught it before the 60-day notice. That gives us time to build a case instead of just react to one." The kitchen was quiet, except for the rain and the scratch of her pen. Jarrett reached across the table and turned one of the pages toward him, reading through the clauses she'd annotated. He read slowly. He wasn't pretending to follow. She could tell the difference. He was actually reading. Actually parsing the language, working through it the way a man works through unfamiliar terrain when he's determined to understand it, rather than just cross it. After a while, he set it down. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning. I need to see the original document from the vault," she said, "and I need to know if there's anyone in Dustville, a lawyer, a circuit judge, a territorial marshal's contact who doesn't have ties to your uncle." "Territorial Marshal Hess comes through Dustville twice a year," Jarrett said. "He's out of Tucson. He's got no connection to Thorne that I know of. When's he due next?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. She nodded. "That's workable, if we move carefully." She looked at the pages spread across the table. "The most important thing right now is that none of this leaves this kitchen. If your uncle has any indication we've found the alterations, the original document in that vault becomes a target." Jarrett's eyes went to the back window, toward the dark shape of the seed barn out across the yard. "I'll put Hank on the barn," he said. "Good." She gathered the pages into a careful stack, tapped the edges even. "There's one more thing I have to tell you." He waited. "I'm not doing this because I owe you something for the train fare," she said. "I'm doing it because what's been done to this ranch is the same thing that's been done to 100 people who didn't have the tools to fight it. And I have the tools." She looked at him directly. "But I need you to understand what I found and why it matters. I'm not going to handle this in the background and hand you a result. You need to understand every step of what we're doing and why, so that when we stand in front of a territorial court, you can speak to it yourself." Jarrett looked at her for a long moment. "Eastern intellect," he said, almost to himself. "I beg your pardon, something my father used to say. He'd grown up near Cincinnati before he came west. He always said that what broke most frontier families wasn't the land or the weather. It was signing papers they didn't fully understand." He looked at the stack of documents in front of her. He would have liked you. She didn't know what to do with that entirely, so she just nodded and turned to the next page. Then let's make sure his land doesn't end up in the hands of the people who bet he couldn't read their fine print, she said. They worked until 2 in the morning. Maeve came downstairs at some point, looked at the table covered in papers, looked at the two of them bent over them with cold cups of coffee, made a sound that was not quite a word, and put a fresh pot on the stove. She didn't ask questions. She just refilled their cups and went back to bed, and the lamp burned steady in the Silver Creek kitchen, and the rain came down outside, and the work got done. 3 weeks into her life at Silver Creek, Evie could read the land well enough to know when the weather was turning before it turned. The light changed first. It went from the flat, bright white of mid-morning to something yellower and heavier, like the sun was pushing through gauze. Then the horses got restless. Then the air tasted like iron. She learned that from Hank Miller, who'd been running the day-to-day operations of the ranch since before Jarrett came home from the border wars, and had opinions about most things, and kept them mostly to himself, except when he was teaching something useful. He was a weathered man, all leather and patience, with a foreman's habit of explaining things exactly once and trusting you to have been paying attention. She'd been paying attention. She'd also been riding for 3 weeks now, or trying to. The first lesson had been humbling. The horse Jarrett gave her, a bay quarter horse named Clara, steady-tempered and broad-backed, had clearly sensed the hesitation in her grip and decided to test it. Evie had stayed on, but barely, and Hank had watched from the fence rail with an expression that was entirely neutral and somehow deeply amused at the same time. But she kept at it. Every morning after the ledger work was done and the breakfast dishes cleared, she went out to the paddock and got on Clara and practiced what Jarrett had shown her the day before. How to hold the reins firm, but not rigid. Communication, not control. How to use her seat and her legs before her hands. How to read the horse's ears, because the ears told you what the horse was paying attention to before the horse decided to do anything about it. Jarrett was a patient teacher. He didn't talk too much. He demonstrated. He let her try. He corrected once and clearly, and then let her try again. He never grabbed the reins from her hands to show her how it was done. She appreciated that more than she could easily say. On the morning of the 22nd day, he suggested, they ride out to Bitterroot Meadow. It's flat and open, he said. Over coffee, and the ground soft enough after the rain that it'll forgive a bad landing if you need one. I'm not planning on needing one, she said. Nobody ever is, he said, but not unkindly. They rode out after the morning chores. The meadow was about 1.5 miles from the main house, down a long slope of dry grass and scattered pine, opening up at the bottom into a wide flat basin ringed by cottonwoods. The mountains beyond it were still holding some snow at the peaks, and the whole scene in the early morning light was the kind of thing that made Evie understand, in a very concrete way, why a man would fight to keep a piece of land. She was starting to understand why she might too. They worked for about an hour. She practiced transitions, walk to trot, trot back down, controlled turns at the far end of the meadow. Clara was cooperating. Her hands were getting more relaxed. Jarrett rode alongside on his gray gelding, Smoke, occasionally calling out a correction, mostly just riding. She was coming out of a left turn near the cottonwood line when she heard the cattle. Not the usual sound, not the low, occasional shifting of animals grazing. This was the sharp percussion of hooves, lots of them, all at once. And it was coming from the tree line to the north fast, very fast. She twisted in the saddle. The cattle came out of the trees in a dark rolling mass, 30-40 head, bunched tight and running flat out, and they were running directly toward the meadow. Toward her. Clara felt it immediately. The horse snorted hard and shied sideways, and Evie grabbed for the horn on instinct and felt her balance go. She didn't fall, but it was close, Evie. Jarrett's voice, sharp and carrying, from 30 yards, off to her right. Smoke was dancing under him, wanting to bolt, and Jarrett had the horse in hand, but he was too far away. The cattle were moving too fast. There wasn't time for him to cross the distance before the herd reached her. She could see that math clearly. Clara was spinning, trying to decide which way to run, and Evie pulled her attention away from the thundering cattle and put it on the horse under her. Clara's ears were flat. Her neck was rigid. She wanted to bolt straight south, which would take her directly into the path of the stampede's edge. Evie, your reins. Right rein firm. Bring her head left. Jarrett's voice came across the open meadow, like he was shouting through a tunnel. Clear, specific, no panic in it. Left and forward, there's a fence break at the timber edge. Go through it and clear the line. She heard him. She didn't think. She just did what he said. Right rein, firm. Clara's head came around. Then left rein, asking forward at the same time. It felt wrong, felt counterintuitive. Two signals at once, but Clara responded to it. Lurched into a gallop, going left and forward, angling away from the herd. Evie saw the fence break, a gap in the old split-rail line at the edge of the tree shadow. Wide enough, but not by much, and beyond it a shallow dip, and then a rise and then open ground. She pointed Clara at it. She did not shut her eyes. The fence posts blurred at the edge of her vision, and then they were through. And Clara's hooves hit the soft ground beyond and threw up a spray of wet earth. And they were climbing the rise, and the thundering behind them was getting smaller. And then they were over the top, and on the other side, and the meadow and the cattle, and the whole terrifying minute of it was behind them. Clara slowed on her own at the top of the rise, blowing hard. Evie's hands were shaking. She noticed this from a distance, the way you notice something interesting about a stranger. Her hands were shaking on the reins, and her heart was going about twice the speed it should have been, and she was still on the horse. She was still on the horse. She heard smoke coming up the rise behind her, hooves on the slope, and Jarrett came over the top at a canter and pulled up beside her. He took one look at her quick, scanning the frontier scout's habit of rapid assessment, and some of the rigid set of his shoulders came down. You're all right, he said. Not a question. Confirming it. I'm all right, she said. He looked back down the slope toward the meadow. The cattle had slowed now, spread out across the open basin, milling and settling. His jaw was tight. That wasn't an accident, he said. She'd already come to the same conclusion. Cattle didn't come out of a tree line at full stampede without something or someone behind them, and the timing, the direction, it hadn't been random. Someone drove them, she said. Someone who knew we were out here this morning. He was scanning the tree line to the north, eyes moving in a slow sweep. She'd seen him do that before and understood it. Now it was how he looked at terrain when he was reading it for concealment, for movement. Caleb Shaw. He runs errands for my uncle. The name landed with a specific weight. She stored it. Did you see him? Flash of a dark coat in the trees when I first heard the cattle break. Gone by the time I got a clear look. He turned back to her. You did well. You cleared that fence on your own. You told me where to go. I told you there was a gap, he said. You had to find it and take it. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at her hands on the reins. The shaking had stopped. Clara was cropping at the grass on the rise, entirely recovered and apparently unbothered, which Evie found both annoying and reassuring. I was terrified, she said. I know. But I didn't freeze. No, he said. You didn't. There was something about saying it out loud that mattered. She didn't know how to explain it fully, even to herself. She'd spent 2 years being told in words, and without words, that she froze, that she panicked, that she couldn't think under pressure. She'd been told it so many times, and in so many ways that she'd half believed it. She hadn't frozen. They rode back down to the meadow at a walk and gathered the scattered cattle and moved them back toward the north pasture. And they didn't talk much while they did it. But it was working silence, shared and easy. That evening, they sat at the campfire. Hank built near the equipment shed while he went to check the fence line for signs of where the herd had been deliberately pushed through. The fire was small and hot and smelled like pine smoke, and the stars were coming out thick and clear above the valley. Jarrett poured coffee from the trail pot into a tin cup and held it out to her. She took it. "How long were you out there?" she asked. "On the border." He looked at the fire. 3 years. "Scouting for the army. Mostly. Some of it I can't talk about. Some of it I just don't." She nodded. She understood the distinction. "Does it come back on you?" she asked. "The things you saw." He was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked. "In loud weather sometimes," he said. "Thunder sounds like artillery at a certain pitch, and there's just a second where I'm not in Arizona anymore." He turned the tin cup in his hands. "I don't sleep the way I used to. I wake up checking corners." He paused. "I haven't told many people that." "I won't repeat it," she said. He nodded. She looked at the fire. The dark beyond it was very deep and very quiet. "The ribs," she said. "In case you were wondering, old fractures. 2 of them from about 8 months ago. He kicked me when I was on the ground." She said it flat, because flat was the only way she could say it yet. "I didn't go to a doctor. I couldn't." Jarrett didn't speak. He didn't fill the silence with the things people usually filled it with: the apologies, the outrage, the helpless. "What do you say?" After something like that, he just sat with it. And somehow that was better than any of those things. "I married him because he was educated and established, and I thought that meant something," she said. "It took me 6 months to understand what I'd walked into. 2 years to find a way out." She drank her coffee. "The mail order advertisement was the way out. I used my last wages from the clerk's office to answer it." "I'm glad you did," he said. "Simple. No performance behind it." She looked at him across the fire. He was looking at her directly, not studying her, not calculating, just present, the way he always seemed to be, solidly in whatever moment he was in. "We're a pair," she said. His mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Close to one?" "We are," he said. "You have a war inside you that you can't always control," she said. "I have a past that shows up in my bones when the weather changes. And we're both still here," he said. "Still here," she agreed. The fire burned down, slowly, and Hank came back from the fence line with confirmation that the rails had been deliberately removed on the north side to funnel the herd. And Jarrett listened to the report with a calm that was clearly the surface of something much colder underneath. He would handle Caleb Shaw. He would handle his uncle. Not tonight, but soon. But tonight there was just the fire and the coffee and the stars, and 2 people who had, each in their own way, survived enough to recognize it in each other. That was worth something. It was worth quite a lot. The posters went up on a Tuesday. Evie found out about them the way she found out most things in Dustville, not from anyone telling her directly, but from the quality of the silence when she walked into a room. She'd driven the supply wagon into town with Hank to pick up dry goods and a replacement latch for her suitcase, which she'd never gotten around to having fixed, but had decided she wanted fixed now, as a matter of principle. The morning had been ordinary. The road into town was the same rutted track it always was, and the sky was the same clean Arizona blue. The feed store went quiet when she walked in, not the polite quiet of people who'd been talking about something private, the specific quiet of people who'd been talking about you. The clerk, a young man named Doyle, who'd previously been friendly enough, all nervous helpfulness, suddenly became very interested in the bags of grain behind the counter. The 2 women near the dry goods shelves turned away before she'd quite made eye contact. She bought what she needed. She said good morning to Doyle. She smiled pleasantly at the women's backs. She found out why on the way out. The poster was nailed to the feed store's exterior wall. Right beside the door, she almost walked past it. Then she stopped. It was printed on cheap broadsheet paper, the letters large and bold and deliberately simple so that nobody would miss the meaning. At the top, in the largest type, "Wanted for inquiry, grand larceny." Her name was printed underneath. Below that, a description that was accurate enough to be unmistakably her height, hair color, last known city of residence, and a claim that one Evelyn Marie Sterling. formerly employed as a court clerk in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, had absconded from the Eastern Territory with funds and documents belonging to the Sterling family estate. There was no seal on it, no issuing authority named, no court designation, just the accusation. Printed large enough to be read across the street. She stood on the boardwalk and read the whole thing twice. Then she pulled it off the wall, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. She found 3 more before she'd gone half a block. One on the post office wall, one on the door of the general store, one in the window of the barber shop, where it had been positioned at eye level with particular care. She collected all of them. Hank was loading the wagon when she came around the corner. He saw her face, or more accurately, he saw whatever her face was doing, that she wasn't quite managing to control. And he set down the bag of oats and waited. She handed him one of the posters. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went cold in a way she hadn't seen from him before. He handed it back. "Judge Thorne's doing," he said. "Almost certainly," she said. "What do you want to do?" She thought about it for a moment. About the clerk in the feed store who wouldn't meet her eyes. About the women who'd turned away. About the way a printed accusation with no evidence behind it could spread through a community like smoke through a sealed room, poisoning the air before anyone thought to question the source. She'd seen this before, not to herself, but she'd seen it. A woman who'd come to the Philadelphia courthouse to file a complaint against her employer. By the time she'd arrived, a rumor had already been circulated among the clerks that she was unstable, that she'd been dismissed for theft, that her complaint was retaliation. The rumor had no origin anyone could point to. It had no evidence, but it had been there, heavy in the room, shaping how people looked at the woman before she'd said a word. Evie had been the clerk who'd processed that case. She'd processed it correctly, thoroughly, by the book, and the woman had won her complaint. She was not going to run. "There's a town meeting tonight," she said. "Thursday evenings, 1st of the month." "Hank, is that right?" "At the meeting house," he said. 7 o'clock. I'll be there," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You sure about that?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." Hank was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the bag of oats and loaded it into the wagon without another word, which was she'd come to understand. His way of saying he was with her. She spent the afternoon in the Silver Creek kitchen with her annotated legal notes and a territorial law reference she'd brought from Philadelphia, a thin volume, much marked up at the margins, called Principles of Territorial Jurisdiction and Due Process, published 1881. She knew the relevant sections well. She reviewed them again anyway. Jarrett came in from the east pasture at 5, and she told him what she'd found. He read the poster she set on the table in front of him. He read it with the same stillness he brought to everything. But his hands on the edges of the paper went very flat. "Grand larceny," he said. "A fabrication," she said. "There was no estate. Gideon's family has no assets I had access to. The only funds that moved were my own wages, which I withdrew from my own account, which is entirely legal." She sat down across from him. "But that's not the point of the poster. The point isn't to create a legitimate legal case. The point is to make this town stop trusting me before I have a chance to present what we found in those ledgers. If they discredit you," Jarrett said. "Following the logic, the ledger evidence dies with the credibility of the person presenting it." "Exactly." She folded her hands on the table. "So I have to go to the town meeting tonight and challenge it publicly before it takes root. If I don't, the accusation becomes the story by default." He looked at her for a moment. "You want me to come? I want you to come," she confirmed. "But I need you to let me do the talking." He nodded. Once, no argument. The meeting house was a long, low building on the north end of Dustville's Main Street, with plank benches inside and an iron stove that smoked slightly at the back. It was full when they arrived, not unusually so, because the first Thursday meeting of the month drew most of the town's working families, but the atmosphere was different from usual. She could feel it as they walked in. People noticed her. Some looked away. Some didn't bother. She walked to the front of the room. She didn't wait for the meeting to be called to order. She didn't wait for the chairwoman, a stout, capable woman named Mrs. Burkett, to work through the preliminary items. She stood at the front, unfolded one of the posters, and held it up. "Most of you have seen this by now," she said. Her voice was clear and carried easily. "I want to address it directly." The room settled. Not friendly, not hostile yet. Cautious. "My name is Evelyn Sterling. I was a court clerk in Philadelphia for 4 years and a printer's assistant for 2 years before that. I came to Silver Creek 3 weeks ago, as Jarrett Vance's intended. These posters appeared in town this morning, accusing me of grand larceny." She set the poster on the table in front of her. "I want to ask a simple question to this room," she said. "How many of you, before you looked at this poster this morning, had been told anything about a federal warrant, a court seal, an issuing jurisdiction? Silence, because I want you to look at this poster carefully." She turned it around and held it up again. "There is no federal court seal on this document. There is no issuing magistrate's signature. There is no case number. There is no jurisdiction listed. Under territorial due process law. Section 14. A wanted notice without an official court seal and an issuing magistrate's identification is not a legal instrument. It has no standing. It is a printed piece of paper." She set it down. "If there were a genuine federal warrant for my arrest," she said, "it would have arrived with a U.S. Marshal's seal and a docket number issued from the relevant district court. I challenge Judge Thorne, or whoever placed these posters, to produce that document. A genuine federal warrant, with an official seal." She looked around the room. "If they can't produce it," she said, "then what you saw on those walls today wasn't a legal notice. It was a tool. Ignorance of the law is the heaviest chain the powerful use to rule over you. And when someone uses a printed accusation with no evidence, no seal, no court behind it, to destroy a person's reputation in a community, what they're counting on is that you won't know to ask for those things." The room was very quiet. "I'm asking you to ask," she said. "Not for my sake only, for your own. Because the same technique that put my name on those walls this morning has been used on this ranch's mortgage documents for 11 years. And if it can be done to a deed and to a woman's reputation, it can be done to any of you." She stepped back from the table. Mrs. Burkett, who had been watching from her seat with an expression that had moved through several stages during Evie's speech and arrived at something that looked like measured respect, spoke first. "Miss Sterling," she said, "can you tell us what law section you just cited? I'd like to look it up myself." "Territorial due process, Section 14, Evie said. "It's in the 1881 Principles publication. The Territorial Library in Dustville should have a copy. I'd encourage everyone in this room to read it. Knowledge of your own legal rights is the most effective protection you have against people who'd prefer you didn't have any." An older man near the back, a homesteader, from his clothes raised his hand. "Who do you think put those posters up?" "I have a strong suspicion," she said, "but I'm not going to name anyone tonight without evidence I can put in writing. When I have that evidence in a form that will hold up in a territorial court, this town will be the first to know." She looked around the room once more. "Thank you for your time," she said. She sat down. Jarrett, beside her, hadn't said a word the entire time. He was quiet for a moment. After she sat, then, under his breath, low enough that only she could hear it, "Remind me never to cross you in an argument." She kept her expression neutral. "I've been saving that speech for a while." "It showed," he said, "around them." The room was still absorbing. She could see it happening, the whispered conversations, starting up between neighbors. The woman in the third row, who'd turned away from her in the feed store that morning, now looking at the poster with narrowed, reconsidering eyes. The homesteader at the back was writing something on a scrap of paper. Territorial due process. Section 14, probably. It wasn't a complete victory. Some of them would go home tonight, still not sure what to believe. That was human nature, and she knew better than to expect otherwise. But the narrative had been interrupted. The accusation was no longer the only thing in the room. She'd given them a question to ask, a section to look up, a standard to apply. That was enough for now. On the boardwalk outside afterward, in the cool dark, with the stars bright overhead and the sound of the meeting continuing inside, Hank appeared from where he'd been standing near the door and fell into step beside them. "Half the homesteaders in there are going to the library tomorrow morning," he said. "Good," she said. "He was quiet for a step or two then. Edmund Vance would have liked you. Miss Sterling, that's the second time I've thought it." She glanced over at Jarrett, who was looking straight ahead with that almost smile. "Hank's not a man who says things twice," Jarrett said. "I heard you the first time, Hank," she said. Said Hank, and said nothing else for the rest of the walk to the wagon. She climbed up to the bench and looked back at the meeting house as Jarrett climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. The light was still on, inside. People were still talking. That was all she'd wanted. She faced forward, and they drove back to Silver Creek in the dark. And she was already thinking about the next step. The smell woke her before the sound did. Smoke has a way of finding a person in their sleep, working under a door and down a hallway until it becomes part of the dream itself. Evie surfaced from something that had already gone strange and gray, and for a moment she lay there trying to place why the air tasted burnt. Then she heard Maeve's voice, sharp and cracking through the house. Fire. The seed barn's afire. She was out of bed and down the attic stairs before she'd fully decided to move. Through the kitchen window, the yard glowed orange, and past it, past the corral fence, the seed barn stood wrapped in flame from the base of its walls up through the loft door. Sparks lifted off the roofline and scattered into a sky already thick with storm cloud, and thunder rolled somewhere behind the smoke like it wanted a share of the noise. Jarrett was already at the door, pulling his boots on standing up, one hand braced against the frame. "The vault," he said. It wasn't to her. It was to himself. The way a man says a thing to make himself move faster. Jarrett. Wait? He was already outside. She followed him as far as the porch, and stopped there because Hank caught her by the arm, his grip firm but not unkind, and said, "You stay put. I'll get buckets going." He was gone before she could argue, shouting for the hands to rouse and bring every barrel of water on the property. She watched Jarrett cross the yard at a dead run. The barn door was already burning at the edges, but the vault sat under the floorboards near the back, behind stacked feed sacks that hadn't caught yet. He went in low, one arm up over his mouth, and the smoke swallowed him whole. She stood on that porch for exactly 4 seconds. Then she went after him. Nobody grabbed her this time. Hank was down at the well with 2 of the hands, working the pump handle like his life depended on it, and Maeve was herding the younger ranch boys toward the water trough, with orders barked in a voice that cracked with fear, and refused to show it. Nobody saw Evie cross the yard in her nightgown and bare feet, the ground already hot in places where embers had landed. She stopped at the barn door. The heat hit her like a wall. Inside, through the smoke, she could see the shape of him near the back, crouched at the vault door, working the iron latch loose with his bare hands. Jarrett. He didn't hear her, or he heard her and couldn't answer because he was coughing hard, one hand braced on the vault door and the other pulling at the latch. Then the beam came down. It happened fast, the way bad things happen. A crack overhead, sharp even against the roar of the fire, and then a length of blazing timber dropped from the loft and caught him across the leg, pinning him against the vault door. He went down hard. She saw him try to push himself up once, saw his arm give out, saw the smoke close over him like water over a stone. She didn't think about the fire after that. She thought about nothing at all, which was its own kind of clarity. She ran in. The heat scorched the soles of her feet through the packed dirt floor. Smoke burned her eyes shut within 3 steps, and she kept going anyway, one hand out in front of her until her fingers found the rough edge of his shirt. Jarrett. She got her hands under his shoulders. He was heavy, and the beam across his leg wasn't moving, and the fire was working its way along the loft joists above them, with a sound like something tearing. That was when she heard the second sound, footsteps. Behind her, coming through the smoke, unhurried in a way that made her stomach drop before her mind caught up to why. She turned. Caleb Shaw came through the doorway first, his hat pulled low, a rag tied over his nose and mouth against the smoke. And behind him, stepping out of the haze like something conjured out of her worst nights, came a man she hadn't seen in 2 years and had hoped never to see again, Gideon. He looked older, harder around the eyes, the way men get when the world has stopped giving them what they think they're owed. He was wearing a good coat, out of place against the soot and the flame, and he was smiling. "Evelyn," he said, "you've gotten resourceful." She didn't answer him. She got her arms further under Jarrett's shoulders and pulled, and the beam across his leg didn't budge, and behind her the fire climbed another rafter with a crack like a gunshot. Gideon crossed the barn floor, unhurried, the way a man walks when he already believes he's won. "Did you really think you could run all the way to this western hellhole and escape me?" "Little wife," he said it almost gently. That was the worst part. 2 years, and he still had that same terrible gentleness. The one that used to come right before the worst of it. He closed the distance before she could get free of Jarrett. His hand fisted in her hair and wrenched her head back, and she felt the cold edge of a blade settle against her throat, felt it press until a thin line of heat opened beneath it, and she understood, distantly, that she was bleeding. "You always did have a talent for making a mess of things," Gideon said, close to her ear now, his breath foul with whiskey and smoke. "The estate money, the forged accusations, all that trouble, when you could have just stayed where I put you." "Let her go," Jarrett said. His voice came out ragged, half swallowed by smoke, but it carried. He'd come partway back to himself, one hand braced against the vault door, his legs still trapped beneath the burning timber. And even like that, even pinned and choking on smoke, there was nothing broken in the way he said it. Gideon glanced at him with something close to amusement. "The rancher," he said. "How touching. You'll forgive me if I don't take instruction from a man who can't stand up." Caleb Shaw had moved to the vault, was working at the latch. Jarrett had already loosened, muttering something about the papers and time running short. Smoke rolled thicker along the loft, and somewhere above them, a section of roof groaned. The sound of wood giving way to heat it could no longer hold. The blade pressed harder against Evie's throat. "We're going to walk out of here together," Gideon said. "You and me, and your rancher friend is going to stay right where he is and think very hard about the last 2 minutes of his life." Evie's heart was going so fast she could feel it in her ears. But underneath the fear, underneath the old animal terror of his hand in her hair and his blade at her skin, something else was moving, something that had been building for 3 weeks in a locked attic room, and a kitchen full of ledgers, and a meadow where she had not frozen. She thought about the key under her pillow. She thought about the revolver he'd left on the floor without being asked. She thought about the sleeve of her nightgown and the small, hard weight sewn into the seam of it, because she had learned a long time ago never to be entirely without a tool of her own. Not after the first time. Not ever again. Gideon's grip tightened in her hair. "Nothing to say?" he asked. "You used to have so much to say," behind him. The beam pinning Jarrett's leg shifted an inch as the fire ate through it, and flame licked closer to where he lay. Evie's hand moved toward her sleeve. The heat kept climbing. Smoke rolled black across the rafters, and somewhere above the roar of the fire. A section of the loft floor let go, with a sound like the whole sky cracking open. Timber and sparks raining down. And for one suffocating second, the barn was nothing but flame and smoke, and the cold edge of a blade at her throat. And Jarrett, unmoving, pinned beneath the burning beam, close enough to the spreading fire that another minute might be all he had left. Evie had spent 2 years learning to read a room before she said a word in it. She had learned it in her marriage, out of necessity. The way you learn to read weather, when your life depends on getting indoors before the storm breaks. She read Gideon's grip now, how it had loosened just slightly as he turned to watch Caleb work the vault, how his attention had split between her and the papers he'd come for. That split second of divided attention was all she needed. She drove her elbow back into his ribs hard and felt him grunt and stagger half a step. The blade slid off her throat, a shallow line of fire where it dragged across her collarbone. But it was off her, and that was what mattered. She pulled the shears free of her sleeve. They were small, sharp, heavy enough for cutting through canvas and leather. The kind of tool a print shop girl kept close because a good pair of shears could fix 100 problems a person wasn't supposed to need fixing. She'd carried them sewn into her hem since Philadelphia. She'd never had to use them like this before. She used them now. Gideon was turning back toward her, blade still raised, and she drove the shears into his thigh with everything she had. He screamed, a high, furious sound, and the knife dropped from his hand and rang against the packed dirt floor. She didn't stop to watch him fall. She planted her bare foot against his chest and shoved, and he went backward into a heap of burning straw with a shriek that cut off into choking. Caleb spun from the vault at the sound, one hand going for the pistol at his belt. Evie didn't give him time to clear it. She grabbed a length of fallen post, still cool at one end where the fire hadn't reached it yet, and swung it in a wide arc that caught him across the shoulder before his gun cleared leather. He staggered back into the smoke, cursing, and she didn't wait to see where he went. There wasn't time. The fire was climbing the far wall now, and Jarrett was still pinned beneath the beam, his breathing shallow, his eyes half open and struggling to focus. She dropped the post and got both hands under the burning timber across his leg. It didn't move. She adjusted her grip, planted her feet, and heaved with everything in her body, and it shifted an inch and no more. The heat coming off the wood was blistering. She could smell her own hair singeing at the ends. She looked around fast and saw the same length of post she'd swung at Caleb, lying a few feet off. She grabbed it, wedged one end under the beam, and threw her whole weight down on the other end. The beam lifted. Not far, not for long, but far enough. She dragged Jarrett's leg free with her free hand, felt him gasp at the movement, and let the beam crash back down behind them in a shower of sparks. "Can you stand?" she said, close to his ear, the smoke so thick now she could barely see her own hands. "Barely," he rasped. "Then barely's what we're doing." She got his arm across her shoulders and pulled him up, and together they staggered toward the doorway, the fire roaring behind them, the vault forgotten for now. Because a man's life mattered more than a stack of papers, no matter how much those papers might matter tomorrow. They cleared the door into the yard, just as another section of roof came down behind them in a wall of flame and sparks. Hank was there in an instant, taking Jarrett's other side, shouting something to the hands about getting him to the water trough, about checking his leg. Maeve appeared out of the chaos with a wet cloth, pressing it to the cut at Evie's collarbone with hands that shook but didn't stop moving. "You're bleeding," Maeve said. "It's shallow," Evie said. It came out steadier than she felt. Through the smoke, she saw movement near the tree line. Riders, 4, maybe 5, coming in fast from the east pasture, and she understood in the space of a heartbeat that this hadn't been Caleb and Gideon alone. This had been planned, timed, a coordinated strike meant to burn the evidence and take her back in the same night, while the ranch was too busy fighting fire to fight men. She was not going to let that happen. She left Jarrett in Hank's care and ran for the house. The double-barrel shotgun hung above the mantel, where it always did, loaded, because Jarrett was not a careless man. She took it down, checked both barrels by feel, and went back out onto the porch. The riders were closer now, close enough that she could hear them shouting to each other over the crack of the fire. One of them peeled off toward the barn, toward where Gideon had likely dragged himself clear of the flames. Another two came straight for the house. Evie raised the shotgun, braced it against her shoulder, the way Jarrett had shown her 3 weeks ago on a quiet afternoon that felt like it belonged to another life, and fired a warning shot over their heads. The crack of it rolled across the yard louder than she expected, and the lead rider's horse shied hard, nearly throwing him. "Next one's not a warning," she shouted. Her voice didn't shake. She was faintly astonished by that, in the small corner of her mind that had room left for astonishment. "This is Silver Creek land. Turn back, or I put the next round through you." The riders pulled up short, uncertain, looking to each other for direction that wasn't coming, because the man who'd have given it was somewhere behind them, bleeding into the dirt with a pair of shears in his leg. Hank came around the corner of the house with his own rifle up, and two of the hands flanked him with pitchforks and a shotgun of their own, and the sight of Silver Creek, standing united in the firelight, unwilling to break, was apparently enough to settle the question for the riders. They wheeled their horses and rode hard for the tree line and didn't look back. Evie lowered the shotgun with hands that were shaking now, the adrenaline draining out of her all at once and leaving something cold and hollow behind. She turned and looked at the barn, half collapsed now, flames still working through what was left of the roof, and at Jarrett, propped against the porch post, with his leg stretched out in front of him, and Maeve working fast to check the burn beneath his torn trouser leg. He was looking at her. Through all of it, the smoke, the blood on her collarbone, the shotgun still in her hands. He was looking at her like he was seeing something for the first time. Even though he'd known her for 3 weeks and thought, perhaps, that he already understood what kind of woman she was. "You went back in for me," he said. His voice was hoarse, wrecked from the smoke, but steady. "You'd have done the same," she said. "That's not the point." He shifted, wincing, and Maeve pressed a hand to his shoulder to keep him still. "The point is, you did it. Nobody made you. Nobody told you how." She looked down at the shears in her other hand, still slick with blood that wasn't her own, and then at the shotgun, and then at the wreck of the barn behind her. And she understood, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that the woman standing in this yard was not the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 3 weeks ago, with a bruise on her face and her eyes fixed on the ground. She had not frozen. She had not waited to be rescued. She had found the gap in the fence, and she had ridden through it herself, somewhere beyond the tree line. Caleb Shaw and what was left of the raiding party were riding hard for wherever Judge Thorne was waiting, to hear how badly the night had gone. Somewhere near the smoldering ruin of the barn, Gideon Sterling lay in the dirt with a wound in his thigh and nowhere left to run, because Hank had already gone to bind his hands with rope, meant for cattle. And there was a grim satisfaction in that, in a man who thought he could walk into her new life and take it apart, being left instead in the mud he'd tried to burn her out of. The fire was dying down now, the worst of it spent. The barn, a smoking skeleton against the last of the storm clouds breaking up overhead. Evie set the shotgun down against the porch rail and knelt beside Jarrett, and Maeve moved aside without being asked to let her take his hand. "We saved the vault door," she said, "even if the barn's gone." The iron held. "The papers matter less tonight," he said, "than the fact that you're alive." She looked at him. Soot streaked across his face, his leg bound tight, his eyes bright with pain and something else beneath the pain that she didn't need him to name out loud. "We're both alive," she said. "That's the part that matters." Behind them, the last of the barn's east wall gave way and settled into embers with a soft, tired sound, like something finally allowed to rest. And in the yard, in the smoke-streaked dark, Silver Creek Ranch stood scarred but standing. And so did the two people who had just fought, with everything they had, to keep it that way. Word of the auction reached Silver Creek 4 days after the fire. A notice had gone up outside the Territorial Bank, printed clean and official this time, with a real seal on it and a real signature, because Judge Thorne had learned enough from the failed raid to know he needed to move faster and cleaner. The foreclosure had been filed. The property in question was Silver Creek Ranch, 6,000 acres, and it would be sold to the highest bidder in the town square on Saturday at noon, 60 days early. On the acceleration clause, nobody outside that kitchen table had ever agreed to. Jarrett read the notice standing on the porch, his legs still wrapped. A cane Hank had whittled for him propped against the rail. He read it twice. Then he folded it and handed it to Evie without a word. "He's not even pretending anymore," she said. "He doesn't have to," Jarrett said. "He thinks the barn burned the evidence. He's wrong." She'd gotten the ledgers out the morning after the fire, before the smoke had even finished clearing from the yard, and carried them up to the attic room herself. Wrapped in oilcloth, tucked beneath the floorboard, beneath her cot, where the boards had always been a little loose. Singed at the edges from where she'd pulled them clear of the vault before the beam came down, readable all the way through. She'd also written to Marshall Hess the same morning, a full accounting in her own clean clerk's hand, and sent it by private rider with instructions to ride through the night if he had to. "6 weeks, you said." She looked at Jarrett now. "We don't have 6 weeks." "No," Jarrett said. "We've got until Saturday." The rider came back on Friday evening, and he wasn't alone. Marshall Hess turned out to be a broad, unhurried man with a gray mustache, and the kind of eyes that had seen enough territorial corruption not to be surprised by any particular flavor of it. He sat at the Silver Creek kitchen table for 3 hours, going through Evie's clause-by-clause comparison. The ink samples she'd preserved, the dates lined up against the bank's own recorded statements. "This is thorough," he said, when he finally set the last page down, "more thorough than most attorneys manage." "I had 4 years of practice reading exactly this kind of thing," she said. "I just never expected to need it for my own home." Hess looked at her for a moment, then at Jarrett, then back at the papers. "Saturday," he said. "I'll be there." Saturday came in clear and bright, the kind of sharp blue morning that seemed almost cruel given what was riding on it. The town square filled early. Word had gotten around Dustville fast, the way it always did. And by the time the auction block was set up in front of the bank, half the county seemed to have turned out to watch. Judge Thorne stood near the block in a fine gray coat, looking pleased with himself in a way that made Evie's jaw tighten just to see it. He hadn't spotted them yet. Jarrett had asked Hank to keep the wagon back at the edge of the square until the right moment, and Evie had spent the ride into town going over what she needed to say one more time. Though she knew it cold by now, she'd known it cold for days. The auctioneer called the crowd to order at noon exactly. He read out the property, the acreage, the terms of sale, and asked for opening bids. Thorne's man in the front row called out a number, laughably low. Nobody else bid, because everybody in that square understood, without being told outright, that bidding against Judge Thorne's own interests in his own rigged foreclosure was not a wise way to spend a Saturday. The gavel went up, going once. Evie's hand found Jarrett's on the wagon seat beside her. "Going twice now," Jarrett said quietly, and Hank snapped the reins. The wagon came through the crowd fast enough to turn heads, and right behind it, 2 riders came in from the North Road at a hard canter, one of them wearing a marshal's star pinned bright and unmistakable on his vest. The gavel stopped an inch from the block. Thorne's head came around. Whatever he saw on Jarrett's face, whatever he saw on Evie's, it cost him some of the color in his own. Jarrett climbed down from the wagon, favoring the leg, and crossed to the block with Marshall Hess a step behind him. The crowd had gone dead quiet, the kind of quiet a town goes when it senses it's about to see something it'll be talking about for years. Evie climbed down after him. She was carrying the ledgers, still wrapped in the singed oilcloth. And she stepped up onto the auction block itself, right beside the auctioneer, right in front of the whole gathered square. "Before this auction proceeds another minute," she said, "I'd like the people of Dustville to see what's actually being sold today." "And why?" The auctioneer looked to Judge Thorne. Thorne, to his credit, or his arrogance, waved a hand to go ahead, the gesture of a man who still believed he had the ground beneath him. She unwrapped the ledgers. 11 years ago. Edmund Vance signed a standard mortgage with the Dustville Territorial Bank, she said, her voice pitched to carry across the whole square. This is that mortgage, and these, she held up the pages she'd annotated. The discrepancies marked clean and legible are the clauses added to it after his signature, using a specialized ink formula meant to pass as original. Section 3 converts a fixed interest rate to a hidden variable one. Section 7 creates an acceleration clause timed to hit its threshold this exact season. Marshall Hess has reviewed all of it and confirmed the alteration. A murmur went through the crowd. There's more, she said. The interest actually charged against this ranch doesn't even match the fraudulent clause. It's higher still. Someone has been skimming above even their own forged terms for over a decade, while this family paid every bill they believed they owed in good faith. She looked directly at Judge Thorne now, and 4 nights ago, when Silver Creek's original documents were nearly destroyed in a fire set by men working for that same interest. The man responsible me down from Philadelphia was captured on this property with a knife at my throat. He's currently in the Dustville jail, along with his accomplice, both of them willing, it turns out, to talk a great deal once the marshal explained what leniency might look like. The square had gone electric, whispers turning into open muttering, people turning to look at Thorne with expressions that had shifted in the space of 2 minutes, from deference to something much colder. Ignorance of the law, Evie said, raising her voice one more notch, is the heaviest chain the powerful use to rule over the people who trust them. I would ask everyone here to remember that. The next time someone in a fine coat tells you a document says something it doesn't. Marshal Hess stepped forward. Judge Thorne, he said, I'm going to need you to come with me. There's a fair number of questions here that deserve answering under oath, and I expect the territorial court will be very interested in this ledger. Thorne's mouth opened, whatever defense he'd been preparing, whatever smooth explanation he had ready. It seemed to die somewhere behind his teeth when he looked out at the crowd and saw how thoroughly the ground had shifted under him. 2 of Hess's deputies moved in and took him by the arms. He didn't fight it. There wasn't anything left to fight with, not in front of half of Dustville. Not with the evidence sitting right there in Evie's hands. The auction ended before it had ever really begun. The auctioneer set down his gavel and didn't pick it back up. Somewhere in the crowd, someone started to clap, and then it spread. Ragged at first and then not, until the whole square was ringing with it. Homesteaders and shopkeepers and ranch hands who understood in a way that went beyond Silver Creek alone, that something crooked had just been pulled out into daylight and dealt with. Evie stepped down off the block. Jarrett was waiting for her at the bottom, and he took her hand, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't a single word big enough for what had just happened. 9 miles northeast, Jarrett said finally, quiet just for her. Still ours. Still ours, she said. The seed barn took 2 months to rebuild. The whole ranch turned out for it, and half of Dustville besides. In the kind of barn raising that used to be common before the territory got too spread out and too suspicious of its neighbors to bother. Evie spent those 2 months learning the rhythm of a place healing itself. New timber going up where the old had burned. New rails on the fence where the herd had been driven through. New trust, slower to build than either, growing in the space where fear used to sit. Gideon and Judge Thorne were transferred to the territorial capital under guard, awaiting trial on charges that ran longer than the ledger pages Evie had once spread across the kitchen table. Caleb Shaw testified against both of them in exchange for a lighter sentence of his own, which suited Evie fine. She hadn't needed revenge. She'd needed the truth on the record, and now it was. On the evening, the last nail went into the new barn roof. Jarrett asked her to walk up to the ridge with him. It was early autumn by then. the light going long and gold the way it did this time of year, and the pines up on the high ground threw slanted shadows across a trail. She'd walked often enough now to know every root and stone in it. Below them, Silver Creek spread out in the fading light, the new barn pale and raw against the older, weathered buildings, cattle scattered dark across the far pasture. Jarrett stopped at the top, where the ridge opened out over the whole valley. "I've got something for you," he said. He pulled a folded document out of his coat, and she recognized the paper before she even took it, the particular weight and grain of it, the kind used for land deeds, registered at the territorial office. She unfolded it. Her own name was on it, Evelyn Sterling, listed as co-owner of Silver Creek Ranch. 50% filed and stamped 3 weeks prior at the Dustville land office. "Jarrett," she said, "this is half the ranch." "It is," he said. She looked up at him, and he was down on one knee in the dry grass, looking straight at her with none of the careful reserve he usually kept around his face. None of the stillness he wore like armor everywhere else. "I'm not giving you this roof to shelter you like a helpless soul," he said. "I've watched you do too much for me to ever think of you that way again. I'm giving you half of this land because you're the one who kept it from falling apart. You read what I couldn't see. You stood in that square and took Thorne down with nothing but paper and your own voice. You went back into a burning barn for me when you had every reason in the world to run the other direction." He reached into his coat again and came out with a ring. Plain gold. Nothing fancy, the kind a rancher could afford, and a court clerk would recognize as honest. "I love you, Evelyn Sterling," he said. "Not because you need saving, because you never did marry me. And let's run this place together as equals. For as long as we've both got." She was crying before he finished, not the kind of tears she'd cried on that stagecoach platform 3 months ago, not the kind that came from being broken open by someone else's hand. These came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had been slowly filling up ever since a man had knelt in the dirt at Dustville Station and picked up her scattered pages without once looking at the bruise on her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." He stood and kissed her there on the ridge. The valley spread gold and quiet below them, and when they finally pulled apart, she was laughing through what was left of the tears, because it seemed like the only reasonable response to a life that had turned so completely from what she'd thought it would be. They married 3 weeks later, in the yard at Silver Creek, under a sky so clear it looked freshly washed. Maeve cooked for 2 days straight and complained about it the whole time in a voice that fooled nobody, because her eyes were wet through most of the ceremony. Hank stood up as Jarrett's best man and cried outright, unashamed, and told anyone who'd listened that Edmund Vance would have been prouder of this day than almost any other his son had given him. Mrs. Burkett came, and half the town besides. Homesteaders who'd stood in that meeting house and listened to Evie cite territorial law with a poster in her hand. Ranch families who'd since had their own crooked mortgages reviewed and corrected because of what her ledger work had uncovered about Judge Thorne's dealings across the whole county. Evie wore a simple dress, pale blue, nothing like the somber traveling clothes she'd stepped off that stagecoach in. The scar at her collarbone had healed to a thin white line, and she didn't cover it. She'd decided somewhere over the past months that she wasn't going to spend the rest of her life hiding what she'd survived. When the vows were said and the small crowd was still clapping, Jarrett leaned close to her ear. "Half the ranch," he said. "All of my life. Fair trade. More than fair," she said. "I got the better end of it." "I doubt that," he said, and kissed her again while the whole yard cheered. And up on the ridge, behind them, the pines stood dark and steady against the last light of the day, the way they had for 100 years before, and would for 100 more. A year to the week after Evelyn Sterling stepped off a stagecoach with a broken suitcase and a bruise she couldn't hide. The first printing press in Dustville rolled its inaugural edition off the type. It sat in a narrow storefront on the town's main street, purchased with the settlement money that came through after Judge Thorne's conviction. The building itself deeded jointly to Evie and the town council, so that no single person could ever again own the flow of information through Dustville, the way the bank had once tried to own its land. The front window said, in gold lettering Evie had set herself. The Dustville Free Press. Inside, the shop doubled as more than a newspaper office. Twice a week in the evenings after the presses had run their daily edition, the tables in the back room filled with women from the ranches and the town, and with hands from Silver Creek and the neighboring spreads. Learning to read contracts they'd been handed all their working lives without ever fully understanding. Evie taught those classes herself. She taught them the way she'd once taught Jarrett at that kitchen table, stripping the obscuring language away from the ideas underneath until anyone willing to sit and listen could follow the thread. Read every line, she told them, most evenings, standing at the front of the room, with a mortgage document held up for the class to see, especially the ones that seem too small to matter. The ones that seem too small to matter are usually the ones somebody's counting on you to skip. On the morning the first edition came off the press, Jarrett stood in the doorway of the shop, leaning against the frame with the easy stillness that had never left him. Watching her work, she had their daughter on her hip, 6 months old now, dark-haired like her mother, with a fist closed stubbornly around one of Evie's fingers. With her free hand, Evie was guiding a woman named Sarah Whitfield through the careful shaping of her own name on a fresh sheet of paper. Sarah's hand shaking slightly with concentration, the letters coming out uneven but unmistakably hers. Sarah had come to Silver Creek 8 months back, thin and quiet, carrying a story Evie recognized in her bones before the woman had said a word of it. She'd left an arrangement in the next territory over that had turned as ugly as Evie's own once had. She'd had nowhere else to go, and someone in town had told her about the ranch woman who ran the newspaper and didn't ask questions she wasn't invited to ask. Evie had given her work at the press, and 3 evenings a week she'd been teaching her letters. There, Evie said now, as Sarah finished the last curve of her signature. That's your name. Nobody can write it for you anymore. Nobody can put words in your hand and tell you it's yours when it isn't. Sarah looked down at the page for a long moment. Then she looked up, and there was something in her face that Evie recognized without needing it explained, because she'd worn that same expression herself a year ago in a locked attic room with a key clutched in her hand. Thank you, Sarah said. Don't thank me, Evie said. Keep writing. That's thanks enough. Jarrett crossed the room and looked over her shoulder at the first sheet pulled from the press that morning, still faintly damp with ink, the typeset clean and bold across the top. Nobody believes how much it hurts until you let them see the scars, not as a sign of weakness, as a map of survival and the foundation of freedom. Below the headline ran, the first installment of a series Evie had been writing for weeks, drawn from the case files she'd helped compile against Judge Thorne. Laid out in plain language, any reader in the territory could follow how the altered ink worked, how to check a mortgage for language that didn't belong, how to ask, without shame, for a lawyer's second opinion before signing anything at all. You know, Jarrett said, when I picked your papers up off that platform, I figured you for a woman who liked paperwork. I didn't figure you for someone who'd end up remaking half the county's relationship to it. I didn't figure on that either, Evie said. I just wanted to stop being someone things got done to. He reached out and settled his hand against the small of her back. Easy, familiar, the way he'd have never dared to in those first uncertain weeks. Their daughter reached up and grabbed a fistful of his shirt collar, and he laughed low and pressed a kiss to the top of the baby's head. You did a good deal more than that, he said. Out on the street, the town was waking into its ordinary Tuesday. A wagon rattled by loaded with feed sacks. 2 ranch wives stood outside the general store, comparing the price of thread. A boy ran past the window with a copy of the morning paper tucked under his arm, already reading as he went. The way children do when something new has arrived in a place, and they haven't yet learned to take it for granted. Evie watched him go. Then she looked down at Sarah's careful, uneven signature drying on the page in front of her, and at her daughter's small fist wrapped around Jarrett's collar, and at the press behind her, still ticking as it cooled. Having just printed the truth about 11 years of theft in language, plain enough for anyone to read, she thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach a year ago, certain the whole territory had already decided who she was before she'd said a single word. That woman had been wrong. Same time Thursday, Sarah asked, standing to gather her shawl. Same time Thursday, Evie said. Bring your sister if she wants to come. There's room. Sarah nodded and went out into the bright Dustville morning, her own name still drying black on the page, tucked carefully under her arm. Jarrett shifted their daughter to his other hip and looked at his wife in the doorway of the shop that bore her name on the deed alongside the whole town's future. Ready to head home? He asked. Evie looked around the shop one more time. Press, the tables, the shelf of law books she'd been slowly building for anyone in Dustville who wanted to borrow one. A year ago, she hadn't known if there was a home for her anywhere in this territory. Now there were two. The ranch 9 miles northeast, and this one, right here, built out of ink and paper and the simple stubborn insistence that nobody's name should ever again be written down by someone else's hand. Ready, she said, and took his arm, and they walked out together into the noise and light of the town they'd helped save. There's a moment in this story that lingers long after the last page, the moment Jarrett Vance knelt in the dirt at that stagecoach station and picked up a stranger's scattered papers without once looking at the bruise on her face. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know she could read law like a judge or set type like a printer. All he knew was what was in front of him, a person who needed her papers gathered and hands that told him she'd worked hard for a long time. That single choice to see the work in someone's hands instead of the wounds on their face is the quiet engine that drives everything that follows. Because that's really what this story is about, isn't it? Not just a mail-order bride, not just a corrupt judge, not just a ranch on the edge of Arizona territory. It's about the difference between the story people are ready to tell about you and the story you're actually living. The whole town of Dustville took one look at Evelyn Sterling and decided she was damaged goods, someone to be pitied, or worse, someone to be blamed. And she could have let that verdict stand. She could have spent the rest of her life hiding behind that bonnet, keeping her chin dipped in shadow, letting other people's whispers write her story for her. Instead, she picked up a strap, tied her own suitcase shut, and walked into a future nobody else had written for her. That's the real lesson here, the same one Evie ends up teaching. Evening after evening, to every woman who walks into that back room at the Dustville Free Press. Read every line, especially the ones that seem too small to matter. Because the people who want to control you, a corrupt judge, a cruel husband, a town full of gossip they're counting on you, never reading closely enough to see what's actually being done to you. Literacy in this story isn't just about words on a page. It's about refusing to let anyone else hold the pen on your own life. And then there's Jarrett, a man who never once demanded that Evie be fixed or saved or grateful. He gave her a strap for her suitcase and let her buckle it herself. He gave her half a ranch, not out of pity, but because he'd watched her earn it. That's a different kind of love story than the one this genre usually tells, not a rescue, but a partnership. Not a man saving a woman, but two people building something side by side, each of them stronger for having survived what came before. By the end, Evie doesn't hide her scar. She wears it to her own wedding. And the newspaper she builds becomes a place where other women like Sarah, who arrived with nothing but a story too familiar To Evie's own, learn that nobody can write their name for them ever again. So if there's one thing to carry away from this story, let it be this. The world will always be quick to hand you a verdict based on what it can see on the surface. A bruise, a rumor, a bad first impression. But the measure of a person was never in the marks left on them. It's in what they build afterward, with whatever's left in their hands. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely coincidental, and this video is intended for entertainment purposes only.